When we took the lunch break, Mr. Chairman, I was about to deal with the retained responsibility that Paria retained under the contract. I did observe, as you did, so I agreed with the observation that Paria did not retain much. And of course, that is freedom of contract. Parties could agree the terms. Paria did not retain much, but they had to pay for what they contracted for LMCS to provide, and I'm sure they did so handsomely. So, Paria's retained contractual obligations are really embodied and encapsulated in item 4 of technical specifications. And those are really to supply personnel for organizing work permits and certificates, monitor the contractor's performance and work standards, and carry out quality assurance audits. This, in my respectful views, is normal in even one's domestic arrangements. If you hire a painter and he tells you today when you go to work, I paint in bedroom number 1. When you come home, you inspect, you see bedroom number 1 painted, but you're not expected to see how he mixed the paint, what thinners he put in the paint, and all of that.
Can I ask you about that in this respect, because it just touches back on what we were dealing with before lunch, that at 4.3 it says provide a slot barge, capacity 40 barrels to assist in the removal of the line content. Now, bearing in mind that this is a document which was prepared before any works were carried out,
yes,
for people to understand what it was that they were bidding for, it does seem to me that at that point in time, Paria had at least estimated what they thought was likely to be necessary for removal of the content from the line for the purposes of carrying out the works.
Yes, sir.
And had estimated at about 40 barrels.
Yes, sir.
And a slot barge in order to remove that.
Yes, sir, because I could see Paria retaining that responsibility because, of course, Paria has a responsibility. Although the contract provides for no spill operation, Paria would be the one practically in that context to have the barge available, and they retain the contractual obligations to supply that. But that still doesn't cast on Paria a monitoring responsibility as to the quantity taken out of the line. They just provide the vessel to pour it into. Basically, and that comes down to also the obligation, one of the obligations, the retained obligations, with respect to the draining and filling of the line. Paria is to deal with the method and to keep an eye on the method as opposed to the quantum.
Yeah, I think what I meant by that more than anything else was that the fact that at the time of the drafting of this, in order to be sent out for the bidders to consider bidding for the work, they must have appreciated, since they were only going to provide a slot barge which had a capacity of 40 barrels, 42 gallons per barrel. It's not a very large barge, okay? So they could not have anticipated that there would have been much to be removed from the line.
So what I remembered from the evidence, there are 2 sets of removal, and I think I had to take you to something my friend dealt with this morning with respect to when she said LMCS had inquired us to the amount, and they said it was negligible. I'll deal with that in 1 second.
All right. Yeah.
But I understand the barge was at a different stage because they were to take topside, they were to drain the entire topside, and then they were to drain 36, because when they remove the elbow that connects 36 to the rest of the infrastructure, then there would be a lot of oil because they have 66, which is a 50-inch line prime.
No, I follow that, and I do understand it. It may be that the barge might have had to make 3 trips or something, yes, like that. But what we're talking about is a barge that had a capacity of 40 barrels, not 1,000 or more. What I'm saying is, if they had anticipated that hundreds, if not 1,000 plus barrels had to be removed, topside and or bottom line, you wouldn't have provided a barge which could only hold 40 barrels, would you? It would take forever.
I don't understand the evidence to be that the barge was solely for the removal of all the material to be removed, all the contents, because that's why they were pouring some back into 111.
What they're saying is that they're providing this bidding document identifies what they regarded as their responsibility. They're not talking about using a line to remove the material at all, are they? They're talking about the material being pumped or blown, whichever it is, into a barge which only had a capacity of 40 barrels.
Not all the material, sir. That's why it's connected to line 66. The barge is for a part of the process. So if they need to, for example, if they just need to take out a 10 barrel, for example, they need to put it somewhere.
Yeah.
But Paria is concerned about spillage and pollution. Yes. So the obligation is really to assist in the removal, but I did not understand the evidence at all and all the documentation that all the product to be removed to get the 35 ullage was to be put into that barge. I didn't understand that at all. Because then so it's inconsistent with even the connecting of the evidence of
if that's
Ali
right,
Senior.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Mr. Peterson, but if that's right, why wouldn't it have listed under Paria's responsibility to provide the sea line to take whatever was to be removed on shore and placed in a tank?
So I could see that not being here because it can't go anywhere else. Because it's in Paria's compound, Paria's infrastructure. 36 is connected by an elbow to 66 and other lines. So I don't think I need to specify that we'll provide lines because the lines are there. So the barge.
So why do you need to provide a barge?
Because I understand that the barge is to assist. For example, when they could not pump, if they needed to take a line to take out 20 barrels, they can't put it back into the lines, into 66. They will then put it in the barge. So the barge may not, at the end of the day, have been used. It was used, but it doesn't have to be used. That's how I understand this contractor of operating.
All right.
The barge was not intended to be the sole vehicle to remove the content of the line.
But in such a comprehensive document, I'm surprised they wouldn't have said something about it's to be, the lines otherwise to be used and stored in one of our tanks. You see?
Because, but then, sir, to take your point to its conclusion, then the provision of the work instruction is inconsistent with the provision of a badge if the badge is intended to be the sole source of transportation of the fuel. Then tank 111 here would have had no relevance if the source of removing the oil from 36 is meant to be exclusively the use of the slot badge.
Yeah, I mean, the difference being there's a 8-month gap between the two documents. The first document is dated April of 21 when they were looking for the bid. This one, no doubt, once they perfected many of the issues that arise from that, is dated the 5th of January 22. So 8 months later, they're now using a tank rather than a barge. Anyway,
I think I just pointed out. The barge was also employed and was, so.
Yeah, and I note that actually that document does deal with a barge. At point 6.4, removal of elbow on the SL riser at berth 6, where it actually points out that they are to position slops barge with catchment and drain hose, drain the upper section of the 36 riser to the slops barge, open the valve in the stub-in section location below the flanges. I'm talking gibberish to me, but in any event, what it amounts to, as I understand it, is that the slops barge is to be used for the purposes of draining material from the above waterline.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So
and that brings me perfectly.
So you're saying that that's why this document doesn't refer to the pipeline being used to drain the material from the subsea line.
Exactly, sir.
All right.
And that brings me perfectly to the point that my learned friend was being dealt with this morning for LMCS. I think my friend misinterpreted the evidence when she said that they were checking with Paria, and Paria keeps saying the amount coming on the other end was negligible. Under the cross-examination by Mr. Maraj, my learned friend, at day 4 of the transcript, page 36 and 37, Mr. Maraj had been cross-examining and got from Mr. Ali Senior about negligible being the answer. And Mr. Maraj said, but that is with respect to topside. correct? And Mr. Ali said yes. So that negligible indication from Paria to LMCS was with reference only to the topside removal, not the rest of the 36 line, just the topside elbow.
Sorry. So the negligible amount was in relation to what was removed topside?
Topside. And that could be from at page 36 and 37 of day 4 of the evidence, of the transcript.
Who was it?
Cross-examination by Mr. Maraj. It's under the rubric
of
Kazim Ali.
Kazim, right, okay.
Yes. Under the rubric cross-examination by Mr. Maraj, SC.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
During the course of the evidential hearings here, sir, Paria witnesses have been cross-examined extensively with a view to establish that Paria, through its agents, Kenson, in particular, Houston Majad Singh, was bound by extensive obligations ordinarily imposed on an applicant under the permit to work system. You may remember that cross-examination, sir, where they went to where the witnesses, the Paria's witnesses were taken to the rubric of applicant under the permit to work system, and by that means sought to impose on the Paria employees / Kenson certain obligations beyond what was retained in the contract. Our respectful submission on that, Mr. Chairman, is those work permit systems or the work permit form for the applicant in the context of this contract is not applicable to employees of Paria and employees of Kenson, because the principle there is so that it's inconsistent if the permit to work is applied to those employees. It would be inconsistent with the terms of the contract, the obligations contractually retained by Paria. Because the question will then be whether the permit to work could expand the contractual terms. And our respectful submission is that it cannot. And there's legal authority for that, sir. That the permit to work has to be submissive to the host contract. So where a contract seeks to incorporate another document that may be inconsistent with some of its terms, in this case, the retained obligations contractual obligations by Paria, the permit to work is to be read against the background of the host contract, and the terms of the contract will take precedence over the incorporated document. We have authorities to that, sir. And as I'm on that, I was speaking with my team during the break, and we have a comprehensive speaking note, and with your approval, sir, we could file it, because I realized that I underestimate 2 hours would not be enough. So if we get your leave, it can save me some time. I will stay within my 2 hours, but we seek your leave to file what we will commonly call a speaking note.
No, I do the same myself, have a speaking note when I'm addressing a court, and I'm perfectly happy for you to,
you have the cases,
supply
you have cases here to support that proposition.
Well, that would be useful, if I may say so. I'm perfectly happy with that. I'm not sure it's particularly controversial to suggest that obligations that might arise in another context must necessarily be subservient to the primary contract.
If there are inconsistencies.
Where there is an inconsistency between the two. It rather presupposes that one has to find that there is an inconsistency in the first place.
Yes, sir.
But yes, I take your point.
Thank you, sir. So I can move on. So the terms of the contract between LMCS and Paria are contained in the walls of the technical scope of works and Paria's general conditions of contract. Paria permit to work procedure is a document incorporated into the technical scope of works by reference. See paragraph 5.1.2. I hope I have those numbers correct now. And 8.9, subparagraph 8.0.
Just a minute.
That one is correct.
What document are we dealing with? Are we still on the scope of work?
Technical scope of work, yes, sir.
Yes, and you're referring me to paragraph
5.1.2.
Point 2, right?
And
under contractor's responsibility.
Yes, sir. And 8.9.
Right, just a minute. Yes.
Subparagraph 8.0.
8.9. I just need to get to 8.9.
So I seem to have the numbers wrong.
This one is
8.9, subparagraph
8.2.
8.0, yeah, that's what I said. Yes. 8.0. Right, am I wrong?
The first one is wrong. It's 5.12.
5.1. Oh, yes, and the first one I said 5.1.2. That's the same error from earlier, so it's 5.12.
5.12, right.
5.12.
Good, because I didn't quite get what you
Yes.
said. Yes, all right. Hang on a
I
second.
didn't do the further correction from earlier. And 8.9, subparagraph 8.2. And our respectful submission is that that incorporates the permit to work procedure
Yes.
by reference to those two paragraphs.
To maintain permits to execute the entire job, the contractor shall become familiar with and conform to Paria's permit to work procedure at his own expense and limitations, provisions or requirements in or pertaining to the permits. So it incorporates the permit to work procedure
Yes,
within the contract.
Yes, sir.
But what you're saying is that if there's something inconsistent in that permit to work procedure with the primary contract,
You go back to the host
you have to
contract.
go to the primary contract.
The host primary contract.
And so you've referred me to that paragraph in 8.9, was it? 8.9 what?
8.9 sub 8.0, subparagraph 8.0.
Gotcha. Yes. Gotcha.
The technical scope, sir, also places the following expressed contractual obligations on LMCS. 1, to execute the works, to provide full-time supervision. 2, I need to sleep. Full-time supervision for the works, and I wish to ask commissioners to underline full-time supervision. 3, to implement an appropriate HSC management system for its employees. 4, to prepare job hazard analysis and risk assessment in relation to the works. 5, to ensure that its employees are aware of the hazards related to the job. 6, to have an appropriate medical emergency response plan for its employees for injuries or illness. Why, you go take over? Oh, no. I want to rest, I will finish. I want to rest. 7, Mr. Chairman, to provide its employees with the required PPE. You don't need to spend time on that. 8, to instruct its personnel on the safety regulations, safe working practices and conditions that are required for an industrial marine environment. And 9, to provide all safety devices, emergency response equipment, and other equipment for the job as required for the task of the risk assessment and the job hazard analysis. These express contractual obligations make it clear that LMCS, not Paria, is to be knowledgeable of the hazards associated with the works, the necessary controls for these hazards, and the safety of all its employees engaged in executing those works. Given that these express contractual obligations are imposed on LMCS, then to require Paria's members of the Commission to require Paria to be responsible for the same obligations under any or by virtue of the permit to work procedure would conflict with what the parties had agreed in the provisions of the written contract. Again, freedom of parties to contract. And it would be contrary to good business common sense. I don't need to pound this point much. I think Mr. Pegas, he's not here, but Mr. Pegas made that point, I think, very, very powerfully. An obligation which the parties had expressly contracted that LMCS will bear that responsibility. And it has always been a standing principle of contract that parties are free to contract as they see fit. In the circumstances, Mr. Chairman and Member Wilson, it would plainly be wrong if this Commission, and I say it with respect, is to view Paria's actions in relation to the events under inquiry as though it carried the obligations of an applicant under the permit to work system. That permit to work system in the context of this contract doesn't bear that responsibility on the shoulders of Paria or Kenson. The foregoing contractual analysis is, of course, not to be taken to mean that Paria's entire work permit system is rendered inoperable. That system remains contractually intact and alive, save that the obligation imposed upon the applicant thereunder, the obligations do not bite where Paria or Kenson employee is the functioning applicant. In this regard, there is no question that that part of Clause 5.0 of the permit to work procedure that provides that work cannot start until the work permit is properly authorized and issued still stands. I now wish to move to the execution of the works. My co-counsel is telling me to repeat the point. I don't think that point gets more profound with repetition. But I think Mr. Pegas made that point yesterday, and I made it earlier, that it would not make business sense if both parties were to retain the same obligations.
I do have that point very firmly in mind. Yes, I do. I mean, he made much of it, both in his address and earlier.
Yes, that's clear. The execution of the works, line clearing and installation of the plug. Under the contract, one of the first activities to be undertaken by LMCS was the removal of sufficient fuel oil from the line so as to facilitate the installation of migration barriers in order for the replacement of the sea line riser to be undertaken. It is undisputed that LMCS conducted this activity prior to the 13th of February 2022 using an air blowing method. See paragraphs 42, 43, and 47 of the supplemental witness statement of Kazim Ali Sr., dated the 22nd of November 2022. It is also undisputed on the evidence before this commission that after the process of air blowing had been completed by LMCS, an ullage of 35 feet was measured in the riser. That is not in dispute. See paragraphs 32, 37 to 40 of the supplemental statement of Mr. Ali. On the 13th of February 2022, LMCS installed a migration barrier in the riser to sea line 36 at berth 6. On that date, it also installed a hyperbaric chamber to the said sea line at the same location. These activities were expressly made the subject of Paria's permit to work number 4832. And that permit could be found at page 1075 of the core bundle of documents, 1075 of the core bundle. Thereafter, on the 15th of February 2022, LMCS engaged in a range of activities outlined at paragraph 18 of the amplified statement of Mr. Kazim Ali Sr. No work was undertaken by LMCS on the site during the periods of the 16th of February to the 24th of February 2022. The events of the 25th of February 2022.
Do you agree with me that had there not been the intervention of Mr. Guerra's
disobedience?
Sorry?
Disobedience.
Yes. Disobedience. Certainly his precipitate movement of the barge, the works would ordinarily have been completed under the work permit 4832.
No. No, sir. No, sir. I don't agree with that. I thought where you were taking me is if there had not been the suspension of the works during that period,
yes, that
they might have completed it on the 13th, 14th, and then all of some of the events may or may not have happened.
Yes. Well, no. What I'm asking perhaps badly is that the work permit that is 4832 does its best on the face of it to include the works that needed to be done. So much so that it actually starts to scribble down the side of the page. And it's dated the 13th of February.
Yes, sir.
It would have lasted a week.
Yes, sir.
Taking us to the 20th of February.
Yes, sir.
What I'm asking you really is whether, had it not been for Dexter Guerra's behaviour, suspending all works, would the works not have been done under that work permit?
When you said the works, all the works?
Well, all the works that are set out there. Which includes removing the hyperbaric chamber.
Mm-hmm. No, sir, it couldn't be under that, because that is a point of contention, and you may remember very early in this commission, my cross-examination of LMCS personnel, and they tried to resile in my respectful view from it unsuccessfully. The barrier was to be removed, in my view, and on the evidence, the way it was installed. They, on the 25th, removed the barrier in the chamber. And that is what caused the delta, the latent delta to become active and become an event. The plugs were installed from on top. I don't have all the identification of the evidence now, but you may recall, sir, I was asking, I think it's Mr. Guerra from LMCS, whether the new riser was dressed or undressed, and whether they needed to cut it and do hot works with respect to fitting it back to fall back into the elbow at top side. That is why those barriers were to stay in place, because they use a long tool to install it, and they should have used a long tool after bringing in the new riser to remove them. So in the event they have to cut and adjust the top, the barriers would have been in place to protect the lines from tools falling into it and prevent hot works from going into the hydrocarbons to cause an ignition. So that, notwithstanding 4832, the removal of those barriers would never to be done under that.
Right,
so if even they were to remove the hyperbaric chamber, the barriers were to stay in place, and the barriers were to be removed with a T-tool from on top.
So a new work permit would have inevitably had to have been raised in order to do those works?
Yes, sir. And that's, I think, the clear
even
evidence.
If it was within the time period of this work permit?
Yes. And I think that came over from Mr. Osei, Fleming Holder, and somebody else. Mr. Khan, Mr. Zaid Khan. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
And I'm urged to make a point that we did discuss, that the installation of the plug, one may say, well, what about the installation? The installation of the plug is different from the removal of the plug. The installation of the plug is to create the protection. The removal of the plug exposes one to danger. And that is why that has to be a focused permit to work and deliberate act of removing those. So the removal and the installation are not to be equated with respect at all. I know the Commission is not doing that, but I'm just saying that.
But all of the things, though, set out in the specific tasks listed in that work permit obviously were intended to be carried out under that work permit.
Could be carried out, yes, sir.
Yeah.
Yes. The event of the 25th of February, 2022. On the morning of the 25th of February, 2022, 2021 in this thing. No, we have 21. We typed 2021. Paria issued permit to work 9320. And this could be, well, I don't need to refer to this, to the point of finding, we dealt with this so many times. Page 1074 of the core bundle.
Indelibly imprinted on my head, yes.
Yes, sir. By which LMCS was authorized to execute the works mentioned therein. The permit made no provision for the removal of the inflatable plug or the mechanical plug. On the contrary, it specifically provided that the barriers were to be used. So it presupposes the continuation of the barrier. And that is my respectful submission that I ask the Commission to note, Commissioners to take on board. That migration, there was reference several times to this phrase, migration barrier to be used. What that tells me, it tells me nothing about removal. It tells me about something that is static and in place, that migration barriers are to be there. The permit was signed by Mr. Rudolph Gonzalez, an LMCS employee. The said permit was issued and signed in circumstances where A, Paria's permit to work procedure provides that work cannot start unless a work permit in respect of such work is properly authorized and issued. 2, the unshaken evidence, and in my view, the unshakable evidence from Paria's witnesses, is that in the absence of a permit authorizing the removal of the migration barriers, LMCS was prohibited from doing so. LMCS was not authorized to do so. Any removal of those barriers, when they did, was, as Mr. Guerra did, in disobedience. The use of work permits is common in the oil industry and in the gas industry, and that where crucial aspects of work are to be undertaken, there should be a separate work permit for every major activity, in this case, the removal of the barrier. That is the evidence of Mr. Zaid Khan of Incotech Limited, an independent industry.
Can you help me about this? If a work permit is to last a week, and it was anticipated that the conclusion of these works would take place from the 25th onwards, why did the work permit 9320 not include those features? Why would it not include them?
The removal of the plug, sir?
Yes. I mean, what it says is the works that they describe being done are to remove and install a 50-inch flange, to remove and install a 30-inch riser pipe, and then to remove the 30-inch solid blank. This is, I anticipate, at 5. Conduct the pressure test on the flange weld.
Yes.
Right? So that's the carver test. And then to remove the chamber, that's the hyperbaric chamber, and blank the top of the new riser. So I'm assuming, although it doesn't actually specifically say so, to fit the new riser.
The blank, yeah, well, yes, sir, but remember, from the cross-examination, there's still works to be done, or possible works to be done on the installation of the riser. It may line up. They may be doing the elbow a bit higher. It may not mesh, and it may not mate, I think is the...
What I'm asking you, I suppose, is this, is that if the specific tasks listed there were to be performed on the 25th going forwards, right, either on that day or the subsequent days, because it lasts 7 days, doesn't it? Why didn't it say to, well, after the conducting of a pressure test on the flange weld, and then remove the chamber, and then blank the top of the new riser? Nowhere does it seem to, seemingly, I see. No, I've got to go back a bit. I understand. Please.
The answer to that question, sir, came, I think, from is either Mr. Osei Hola, Fleming Hola, or Mr. Zaid Khan.
Right.
Pipes are never, no, not that one. Pipes are never left open.
No, that makes sense.
Yes.
I get
so
that.
The point is that when they put that flange, I understand it to be like a temporary cover, and when they're ready to do all the connection to the elbow, they remove that. They use the T-tool, remove the barriers, for which there will then be a dedicated independent permit to work to remove those barriers, and then they do the connection if they need to.
Yeah.
So they didn't need to put that in this permit, but they put into this permit up to the point of tapping off the top of the riser, pending the removal of the...
I suppose part of my difficulty is that the specific tasks that are set out in the work permit give you just 3 lines. Right? And to fit everything into 3 lines, as we've seen from the previous work permit, is not always possible. Do you see what I mean? Because they've had to start writing down the side of the page. And all I'm trying to understand from you is this, is that whatever the position might be, ultimately the plugs were to be removed, correct?
Yes. Eventually, yes.
Exactly. And the new piece connecting it all together fitted.
No,
so the riser comes up.
Yeah.
It's got a flat plate on there. They're going to take that off and put the new piece on when out above the water line. Yes. So
yes, sir.
It's all been put back together with a nice new piece of riser.
Yes.
That's the whole point of it, isn't it? What I'm not really understanding is, first of all, why this doesn't include the removal of the plug,
The removal
if
of
that
the
was
blank?
to be done. Yes.
Well, no, that's it, sir. Because it's supposed to cover the placing of the blank, the cover. When the permit to remove the barriers, I could see that permit saying to remove the I don't even think the permit needs to say that, because how you get into the, if it says remove the plugs, you have to remove that to get to the plugs.
Yes.
So I could see the permit either being silent and say, obvious, you have to remove that, or say that and also then provide for the deliberate removal of the plugs. But if they had put it in this permit, it could have caused confusion.
You mean it's deliberately not put into this permit to avoid confusion?
I could see why it would be deliberately not put in the permit.
Right.
Yeah.
All right.
So that's why I didn't find there, sir, because the removal of the plugs would have been independent in a permit, and therefore they could have possibly put the removal of the flange, because it is a step immediately prior, is the pre-step to removing the barriers. So they did not need to put it on this, which is the closing off of that work.
Okay. All right.
But
I hear how you put it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Section 8 could be one of the recommendations from the Commission with respect to adjusting of this form.
Well, I mean, I think there's little doubt that the giving just 3 lines under the specific tasks required is clearly not sufficient, and clearly leaves it open for some doubt about what might or might not be done on any one day, or the sequence in which it might be done, given the importance of the work being done in a particular sequence.
Yes, sir.
All right, thank you.
Just for completeness, the evidence of Osei Fleming holder could be found at transcript of the 6th of January at page 299. The removal of the mechanical plug and the inflatable plug were crucial aspects of the work that the LMCS had to undertake or embark upon. Such removal, they required a specific work permit for that purpose. Mm-hmm. There was nothing mentioned in the work permit concerning the removal of the plugs. Nothing. LMCS and its personnel were trained by Paria with respect to its permit to work system. They were fully conscious of that requirement. At all material times, LMCS was well aware that the permit served as the most powerful control document. I don't have the time, sir, but I just wish to remind the Commission of that email following the step that was taken, the unauthorized step that was taken by Mr. Guerra, where Mr. Ahmad Ali of LMCS, using the email address of Mr. Kazim Ali, had sent an email, and I commend that email.
This one does all the replies to the queries that are raised by Paria.
Yes, sir, and in particular question 2 and 3, where Mr. Ali assured Paria, assured Mr. Archibald that they recognize the paramountcy of the permit to work system and that they will honor it going forward.
Yes.
LMCS and its personnel were trained by Paria to observe that system. At all material times, LMCS was well aware that the permit served as the most powerful document. The language also of the LMCS method statement, and I wish to commend that to commissioners. The method statement dated the 4th of January 2022 provides at the top of that method statement in bold and in italics that all steps identified in the method statement, all steps are only to be carried out in full compliance with Paria's permit to work system. So whatever is set out and in whatever order it is set out in the method statement, it is always trumped by the permit to work system. LMCS recognized that in the email I referred to. Notwithstanding,
I'm aware of that, but I mean, this document is actually appended to the work permit, isn't it?
Yes, sir.
And appears to set out the steps sequentially.
Right.
Does it not?
Yes, I know that question would have been posed. The
Good.
permit to work.
I take it you have an answer to it then.
So I hope to have an answer for everything. Yeah. The permits to work has that attached to it, and it has a certain sequence.
Yeah.
But notwithstanding howsoever it is set out in the method statement, it is always referable back to the permit to work. And
no, I do follow that, yeah. I mean, you just pointed out that paragraph,
yes,
or that sentence at the top of the method statement. But, I mean, it does seem, on the face of it, a kind of obvious question. Well, if anybody who knows what they're doing looked at this method statement, surely they would realise, well, what's set out at 56 and 57 simply cannot be appropriate in the place in which it's put.
One can come to that conclusion, sir, but in the context of this project, if once the haulage was correct, that method statement could have been reversed in any order it wanted, and no event would have occurred. I make the point.
I mean, I think had they done what they should have done and only removed the amount of material from the line that they should have done, it wouldn't have happened. There might have been a little bit of gas coming into the chamber. They might have dropped a tool down inside the pipe, and everybody would have been unhappy about it, I dare say, but nobody would have died. That's beyond doubt. All I'm saying is that Paria's concern were those two things. They weren't in the least bit concerned with delta P because no one considered delta P. So their position was this, as I understand it: do not remove those barriers, because if you do, it might let gas into the chamber or allow something to fall into the pipe. These are two things we do not want to happen. And therefore, when they looked at the method statement and what appears to be a sequential program of work, nobody said, this is wrong. Do you agree?
Nobody said that, sir.
Nobody said it was wrong.
That is the beautiful thing about the permit to work system. It's a fail-safe system.
Well, it isn't, though, is it? I mean, it clearly didn't.
No, it is if people obey it. And that is why Paria makes sure that they are trained in the permit to work system. So they are supposed to know, regardless of what that method statement says. And that could inform why LMCS inserted that on top of there.
No, let's assume LMCS have got this wrong. I mean, I'll go with that, right? They've got the method statement that they've set out, the document that we are looking at, that paragraph 56 and 57, which for those who are watching, includes the removal of the migration barrier and to deflate the plug.
Yes.
Those two things are itemised at number 57 and 56 in a long list of things that go to nearly 100, right? What I'm saying is that anybody at your end, that is to say Paria's end, that looked at the method statement, which they are required to produce by Paria, aren't they?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So Paria require you to produce a method statement of how you're going to do these works. Here it is, Paria. Now, leave aside delta P. It's irrelevant for these purposes because no one recognised delta P. Somebody at Paria presumably read this. Somebody must have read the method statement. And if they read the method statement and come to paragraph 56 and 57, for the reasons I've just identified, nothing whatever to do with delta P, would have been saying to whoever submitted this document, look, I see what you say there and the steps to be done. This is wrong. Do not remove those plugs until we tell you. And it's certainly not at paragraph 56 or 57, because we don't want any of your men to be gassed, and we don't want to lose any of your tools down our tube.
Right. That's one option, sir, and it's an option that could have been exercised, but that's what I'm saying. So that was missed, or was not flagged. But Paria had a permit to work system, which I said is a fail-safe system. So when that is missed, LMCS also telling its people, I have this here, I think I have it right, but you see Paria permit to work system that are trained all in, that is what you abide by. But this, I have it right, but of course I have it wrong. Somebody in Paria may have missed it. But that is why I said the permit to work system is a good default system by Paria.
Because if it's not stated in the permit to work, you shouldn't do it.
Right.
That's what you're saying. Yeah.
No, it's not saying the permit to work that you should do it.
It has to be in there before you can
Yes,
do it.
before you could do it.
But I do
So
understand that point.
It's perfect that if it could have been picked up back there, then...
Perfectly reasonable point to make, if I may say so. But my slight concern with that is that this is specifically appended to a document, that when it says in that document, the permit to work, specific tasks, gives you 3 lines. This is 6 pages long, sequentially. And all I'm saying is that, and maybe I've got this wrong, but if I were working and I were being given this task, I would go to the method statement and I would look at the sequence. I think one of the witnesses said he didn't even do that, but be that as it may. It is perhaps I don't want to characterize it wrongly. I mean, a great shame that somebody at Paria didn't pick that up, even for the reasons that they wanted the barriers in place, because had they picked it up, then this wouldn't have happened, would it?
Well, no, I don't think so. So I think had they picked it up, it would have been corrected. But if LMCS people still want to disregard the permit to work system, or whether the author have a permit to work to remove it, whether that was corrected would not have prevented the event. Because they would have been disobeying the permit to work. That would have been corrected. And in another event, another project, that is a great thing that they should try to be closer and make sure they pick up errors like that. And that is why I say the permit to work system is a great default, because when you miss it there, you can't move forward.
But it is something that Paria could have done. I mean, this is not so technical that they were, or specialists, that they would be unable to recognize that as a problem.
That is why artificial intelligence is taking and replacing us as human beings.
Not in my lifetime, hopefully, or yours, I suspect, but it may affect
because
our children.
As humans, we miss things.
Yes.
I think I covered that. Give me 1 minute, please. I think I covered some of by answering the questions. I just want to wrap up that point by saying, sir, that Paria, we respectfully submit that even on the most generous interpretation of the language on that permit, it could not lead or properly lead to a reasonable construct that it was authorizing the removal of the migration barriers on the 25th. It is simply not ambiguous because it does not deal with removal at all. LMCS in this inquiry also sought in its evidence to contend that the removal of the migration barrier was discussed at the toolbox meeting. I wish to deal with the toolbox meeting. That 2 meetings that morning at 9:15 a.m. and at 9:30 a.m. on the 25th of February. LMCS seemed to be suggesting that the discussion of the barriers had been, the removal of the barriers had been discussed. This position is untenable as a matter of fact. In this regard, Paria respectfully submits, sir, that the removal of the plugs was plainly not discussed at the toolbox meeting on February 25th. This is supported by the contemporaneous documents, namely the toolbox form themselves that had nothing to do with the removal of barriers. As Mr. Khan pointed out, Mr. Zaid Khan in his evidence, he said it makes no reference to the removal of the plugs.
It makes no reference to any work at all.
Yes. In particular, no removal of the plugs. And then, sir, LMCS cannot escape the evidence of Andrew Dutton relatively Dobson. Who's Dutton? Andrew Dobson, his contemporaneous notes written on that same day as to what transpired at the toolbox meeting that morning. And this is significant, sir. And those notes could be found at page 1022 of the core bundle. In assessing evidence and believability and credibility of evidence, a good tool that all tribunals would apply in assessing evidence is whether there was a motive to concoct, fabricate, or alter one's evidence. Significantly, this evidence by Mr. Dobson was prepared by him at a time when neither the Commission of Inquiry was set up nor any legal proceedings were contemplated. Accordingly, there was no motivation for the document to be manipulated. And in this inquiry, no one suggested to him that his notes at that time were fabricated.
I don't think anyone suggested the notes were fabricated. I thought it was more to do with whether he was actually at the meeting. There were two meetings, weren't there? There was one, sorry? Yeah, there's one at 9:15 and one at 9:30. The one at 9:15 took place at berth 6, and the one at 9:30 took place at berth 5. And there was a question about whether he could have been at both, as I recall it, bearing in mind you've got to get from one to the other. And if the one that we're concerned with was at 9:15, he would have had to have delivered the toolbox meeting, then get back onto his boat, whatever boat it was, and then get himself over to berth 6 in order to hear the toolbox meeting at berth 6. And
so he was at the one at... He was at berth 6. In fact, he signed the form at number 39. Is the other way around?
Yes, I thought, and that's right. Didn't he sign the one that he wasn't at, and didn't sign the one that he was at? I can't remember exactly what his evidence was now. It's a little while ago.
No, he only signed...
He only signed one, and he told, I think, me, that he wasn't there at that one.
You're trying to pull up his evidence. It's at page... Oh, no, that's the document.
Well, perhaps somebody can look at it while you carry on addressing me and identify what he did say about it, because I do recall there was an issue about whether he could possibly be at both, and he made clear that he wasn't. I thought made clear that he wasn't at both. Have I got that right? Marjad Singh. Ah, right, that was Marjad Singh. Sorry, it might be my fault. Maybe it was Marjad Singh who was saying that rather than Dobson. Yeah, never mind. I'll take the rap. Sorry, I may have misled you. It may be, it's Marjad Singh, I think, who was telling us that he couldn't have been at both. Correct. So forgive me for that.
Asking the Commission to place substantial weight
on what he says and on his contemporaneous note.
Yes, because his note chronicles what he witnessed, and it doesn't in any way deal with the removal of the plugs. So I commend his evidence for serious weight and consideration.
All right, thank you.
Although contrary to evidence that was led before the Commission by LMCS employee in the person of Mr. Andrew Farah and also the employee, Mr. Dill Paul, we respectfully submit that the Commission ought to reject their evidence for this reason. As to Mr. Dill Paul, it is significant to note that in his witness statement of November 10th, 2022, his evidence was this. And I'm at paragraph 24 of his statement. He said, I discussed general safety as I'm accustomed to doing and identify the general hazards around the work area. I can't recall exactly what I discussed. See paragraph 21. And Mr. Kazim Ali, Jr., who my friend this morning said would have been the one discussing this. Kazim Ali Jr. also spoke about the job to be done. I can't remember or recall what he said about the job in particular. He gave no evidence whatsoever in that statement that the removal of the plug was discussed. Kazim Ali's statement could be found at, Dilpol's statement could be found at paragraph 24. It is my respectful submission that something as the removal of the plug, one remember discussing safety, one remember discussing the general hazards. I commend that had something as significant as the removal of the plugs been discussed, that would have find expression in their memory. Further, in Dilpol's statement given to OSHA, which is dated, and this is important so with respect to the dates, this event occurred on the 25th of February 2022. Mr. Dilpol gave a statement to OSHA, dated March 14th, a mere 3 weeks after this incident. And he was speaking specifically to an agency that is drilling into the events of the 25th. So there's focused attention on the events of the 25th. And in particular, the toolbox meeting of that day. He specifically addressed the toolbox meeting with the agency as to what was discussed, but he did not identify any discussion took place concerning the removal of the plugs. So even if we come here 10 or 12 months later, when he was 3 weeks after the event, one could forgive him if one is reasonably generous. One could forgive him for not remembering, but 3 weeks after, in the fresh stress of the event, he did not recall to tell the OSHA authority, which should have been focusing on that event, as to whether the plugs was discussed. Further, although under cross-examination, Mr. Dilpol sought for the first time to suggest that the removal of the migration barrier was discussed. He did that here for the first time. It does not accord with his earlier detailed evidence as to the toolbox meeting. Finally, sir, Mr. Dilpol did not present as a witness of truth. My respectful view is that he was evasive under cross-examination and effectively asked the Commission to believe, he's asking you to believe, that his memory got better with time. Because in March he did not recall, but when he came here in November, he wanted to recall and accept his testimony that the removal of the barriers had been discussed. There's only one liquid I know that gets better with time, sir. I think it's wine. This is not credible testimony.
Whiskey works too.
I must try that. This is not
Don't believe you haven't.
This is not credible evidence or credible testimony from Mr. Dilpol, because his memory back in 2014, in the 14th of March 2022, to the authority did not speak to that event. As to the evidence of Mr. Andrew Farrer, although he did testify that the job scope for the day, which included the removal of the plug, was discussed at the toolbox meeting, that evidence is not supported by the toolbox forms, nor the contemporaneous note of Mr. Andrew Dobson. And that is why I asked the Commission to attach significant weight to Mr. Dobson's evidence, because it shows that Mr. Farrier could not be accurate. I want to put it neutral.
On any view, the failure to record it in the document is a significant, as I think has been conceded, a significant flaw.
Yes. And Mr. Farrer also did not produce any contemporaneous notes, but he relied on his memory again of 9 months prior. Let's skip that. We therefore submit on behalf of Paria and Heritage Sir that the Commission ought to find as a fact that there was no discussion in relation to the removal of those plugs at that toolbox meeting on the 25th of February 2022. In any event, we respectfully submit that even if the removal of the plug was discussed at the toolbox meeting, which we deny, such discussion was not capable of overriding the express requirement imposed on LMCS and its personnel to fully comply with the clear requirements of the Paria permit to work system. In all the circumstances, the deliberate removal of those barriers by LMCS on February 25th caused the Delta event to become active. And I hope I put the terms correctly. Because it was wholly unauthorized and in disobedience to Paria's permit to work system, and it wholly disregarded the well-established standards of practice in the industry. Paria wishes to make one further point, sir, in relation to the events of the 25th of February 2022. And that additional point is this. If this learned commission rejects Paria's submissions as set out above, to the effect that the obligation imposed upon the applicant under its permit to work system that did not, as a matter of construction, did not apply to Paria's employees or those of Kenson on the facts before this commission, Paria cannot, and I say this with respect, cannot be found to have been in breach of the applicant's duty under that system to continually monitor the job in accordance with clause 5.1 of the permit to work procedure. The reasons for this are relatively straightforward. The duty to continually monitor in the context of the permit to work system can only be construed as a duty to monitor works which are the subject of the daily issued permit to work. The removal of the migration barriers was not subject to any permit to work, and accordingly, no duty to monitor arose at that point. Second, a duty to monitor can only properly arise at a time when works are scheduled to be executed. Indeed, if the works were wrongly executed by LMCS outside scheduled working hours, it could hardly be said that Paria was in breach of any duty to monitor. So too in the case of works executed at lunchtime. In this connection, it is significant to note that on the evidence, the activities relative to the removal of the migration barriers stopped at 1:45 p.m., 13:45, and occurred during the luncheon interval on the 25th, which resulted in the splash being seen on the screen at around 2:45 at berth 6. This much is confirmed by the combined evidence of Andrew Dobson, which could be found at paragraph 12 and 13 of his statement, and also of the combined evidence of...
Is it your case that 2:45 is lunchtime?
No, they took lunch. That's when they took lunch. In this commission, lunchtime is 2 o'clock, but...
Not always.
That's when they took lunch. Because remember the evidence of Dobson?
I do.
Yes.
Well, yeah, you make your point
yes.
about it. I have certain reservations about that, but it doesn't really. Does it really lie in anyone's mouth to be able to say that because the work permit didn't permit the removal of the plugs, there was no duty to monitor the removal of the plugs, when there is a stop system in existence that allows the lowest paid member of staff to be able to say, you're doing something you shouldn't be doing, stop.
Yeah, I say if I'm to go with that for the time being, the lowest person could have stopped. if works scheduled to go on. So that provision.
Well, we know that there was somebody who did actually see what was going on.
Yes, Kirk Scott. I think Mr. Kirk Scott.
Yes.
I think he was passing and he saw this splash on the screen. But the point is that to answer your points as to whether there is a duty on anybody to ring the bell, so to speak, but that is where work is in progress. But the work had stopped. There was on lunch. And that is the unauthorized, resuming of the work. So when one is considering any obligation to monitor, one has to take into context the time at which the wrongful removal, apart from wrongful removal
so you're
of the
saying
barriers,
that it happened all during lunchtime, so even if there was some monitoring supposed to take place, there was no monitor there to observe the work.
That's it, sir.
Gotcha.
Yeah, that's true too. That must be. Mr. Chairman, I'm told that I didn't say that there was no duty to monitor when the works were not in progress. I said that. I said even if one had an obligation to monitor, one could not monitor work that would resume off for schedule.
Sure. I understand that's what you're saying. There's, first of all, there's no duty to monitor at all at the level that's been suggested by LMCS. If there is a duty to monitor at all, it must at least take place when work is actually scheduled to take place. And if something took place during a lunch break, then there would not necessarily have been anyone to monitor, and neither would there have been any obligation to do so.
The removal of the plug is unauthorized, and the resumption of the work during the lunchtime is unauthorized. So there's no obligation could have been to monitor, could have ever been complied with.
Doesn't arise.
If one had that obligation.
I got you. It doesn't arise at all. Right.
All right. Finally, sir, I wish to move to the event, the rescue and recovery.
Did you want to make this point?
Which one?
How much longer do you think you're likely to be, given that you're over your allotted time? I'm not going to stop you, but
20, sir.
20 minutes. Yeah. You all right? Do you want to take a break?
5 minutes.
5 minute break. Let's do
Yes,
that. Let's take a 5 minute break, and then we can conclude.
to the plug when he demonstrated that there were systems for attaching the inflatable plug to the chamber. And I think the chairman had asked, had that been rigged above, whether it would have prevented disappearing into the pipe. And I commend that evidence to your consideration. Not only that the plug would not have disappeared into the pipe, I think most likely the men would not have either. So the manufacturers of that plug had certain specifications as to how to operate that plug. So I ask you to take that into account, that there had not been compliance with the manufacturer's specification in employing that plug. And as Mr. Zaid Khan said, that it was possible to attach cables to the plug and fix it to the chamber, which could have, had the event on the 25th still occurred, we may have had a different result.
Yeah, I mean, we don't know what breaking strength any cable might have had. I don't imagine they were using, anchor chain or something like that. But
well,
it would depend on the strain and what force was on that plug.
Yes, so I'm hoping that some of that may be revealed when the chamber is
well, it's one of the things that I would love to have a look at, and one of the reasons why I'm particularly anxious to see the...
I think that may shed some light on that.
Yeah. All right, thank you.
The rescue and recovery efforts. In the course of this inquiry, Paria has been the subject of a number of criticisms in relation to its conduct concerning rescue of the divers from that pipeline. On a proper review of the factual and expert evidence adduced before this commission, these criticisms, to a great extent, cannot be supported. As will be explained below, Paria's action in relation to the rescue efforts were wholly reasonable given the conditions under which it was operating on the evening of the 25th of February 2022, not today. The resources available and the need to take into account a safety potential for the proposed rescuer would have been a live issue for the decision makers at Paria. In examining the reasonableness of Paria's conduct, I ask this commission and I invite this commission to consider 11 factors and bear them in mind when assessing and judging Paria. First, in the context of the contractual arrangements between Paria and LMCS, the obligation to formulate an action, an emergency rescue plan in respect of LMCS employees rested on the shoulders of LMCS, not Paria. Paria was not obligated to play anything other than a supportive role to those efforts and plans. Second,
I'll take a note of each of these points, 11 points that you've got. But before you move on, do you say that, in relation to your first point, that Paria had no duty to effect a rescue at all? I mean, duty in a legal sense.
Yes, that's correct.
That's correct.
Right. Yes. Thank you.
Second, between 2:45 p.m. and 5:30 p.m. thereabouts, Paria was unaware that the divers were in the pipe. And I don't think that could be challenged, and I think it's accepted in this commission that when Mr. Bodram emerged from that pipe was the first time persons were aware that the men were in the pipe because they were searching at sea. Third, LMCS personnel were generally uncooperative and or hostile to Paria's representatives on the 25th of February 2022. And I pause here to make the point, Mr. Chairman, I think you asked my friend this morning, and I did not remember that Mr. Kazim Ali Sr. and Mr. Colin Piper knew each other well. In fact, Mr. Piper's evidence is that he knew Kazim Jr. as a lad. I think he knew the young lad. I don't subscribe to getting personally involved in a matter, but Mr. Kazim Ali had not testified here that I went to Colin because they know each other. My son is in the pipe, I want to die. This is my plan. And that is missing from this commission of inquiry. There is no evidence that LMCS had a plan. All we keep hearing, LMCS wants to dive and Piper stopped them. They wanted to dive and Piper stopped them. But nobody said LMCS had a plan A, B, C, D that they communicated to Paria or to Mustaq that this is the plan and they refused it. Apart from whether it should be in writing and de-risk and all of that, there's another issue. But even the existence, the fact of the existence of a plan, no one has said that I had that plan and I told Mr. Piper this. All I'm hearing is we had a plan and we told him we had a plan. Nobody said this was the plan and I communicated to Mr. Piper at so and so time and tell him to consider this. And he told me no, he didn't like that or he didn't like that. At least for the Friday evening. That's what we're dealing with, sir.
But if your first point is that there is no obligation on the part of Paria to effect a rescue, no legal obligation, I leave aside morality at the moment, no legal obligation on them to effect a rescue, and the LMCS appreciated that, was it necessary for them to communicate such a plan to the IMT?
The reason it's necessary, sir.
And second to that is, the submission that has been made is that Mr. Kazim Ali was wholly unaware of the existence of this IMT.
I heard my friends say that. I can't remember that being the evidence, but subject to be corrected. But that would be very, very spectacular. And Mr. Kazim Ali, who boasts of being in the industry for all those years, is not aware that an event like this will trigger the formation of an ICT.
Right.
That would be a spectacular development.
And presumably concomitant to that would be obliged to have disclosed to Mr. Piper or the IMT, here's my plan.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Third, LMCS personnel were generally well, I got that. Fourth, owing to LMCS rescue plan and its inability to provide adequate resources for the purpose of attempting a rescue, Paria engaged multiple specialist services or service providers. So in assessing Paria's response that evening, sir, notwithstanding the lack of a legal obligation to do so, they engaged Mitchell, they engaged Eastern Divers, they engaged HSSL, they engaged Subsea Global, and Offshore OTSL, and also Hull Support Services. They relied on the connections of the sister company Heritage to activate a lot of these resources, including equipment and also personnel. And also they had the assistance of Mr. Rolf Seals and Heritage Operations HSSE manager Fleming Holder. Paria also contacted the Coast Guard, which would always be an obvious first port of call once we're dealing with a diving issue. Fifth, the information which Paria had concerning the conditions within the pipeline was inadequate in material respects. That is to say, Paria did not know the condition nor the location of the inflatable plug within the pipe. Paria also did not know where the divers were located within the pipe or the physical condition. Sixth, the information Paria had about the conditions which obtained in the pipe indicated that hazards existed therein. Paria was for some time understandably operating under the assumption that significant quantities of fuel oil were present in the line. And I think, Mr. Chairman,
they were best placed to know what was in the line. They were best placed to know what was in the line. Whether they did or not is another matter. But during the course of the evidence that we've heard, I asked, I think, a number of people about that, and what Mr. Miraj did. The fact is, nobody ever inquired of their own records what had actually been pumped out of the line, even though this had now happened.
I think one that could be explained for all parties, sir. Everyone on that evening was operating under the LMCS method statement that a 35 ullage was achieved, so therefore the line has substantial hydrocarbon. We know from this inquiry factually that turned out to be inaccurate. But on the evening, and as I keep saying, when Paria's conduct is being examined, it should be examined at Paria compound Friday evening. Everyone operating, yes, that work was going on. Yes, there were plugs, there was 35 ullage. The plugs were put in, and this event happened. Bodram emerged from the pipe. He came out covered in oil. So everyone operating on the statement of LMCS that a 35 ullage was achieved, so therefore the rest of the line had hydrocarbons, oil. But we discovered from Mr. Khan's analysis that that was inaccurate. But on the Friday evening, that is what persons were operating.
Well, they also had the evidence, or would have had the evidence, of Mr. Kurban going into the pipe.
I'll come into that, sir.
Good.
The emergence of Christopher Bodram from the line at approximately 5:30 p.m., completely covered in oil, supported the assumption that the line had substantial hydrocarbons.
This is number 7, is it?
No, I just finished in 6. Sir.
That's 6
Further,
still.
yes.
Sorry, yes.
Further, as the evening progressed, Paria deduced that the inflatable plug was in the line, thereby giving rise to the possibility of a further delta P event within the line. And that is a debatable point. The Commission will decide on that. But I don't think it can be dismissed as a far-fetched possibility at that Friday evening. Further still, into the night, Paria became aware through the use of cameras that there was also oxygen tank lodged within the line.
Lodged
In the line.
It's not what the
I didn't say
video
wedge,
shows.
I
It's
didn't
not
say
really
wedge,
what the video shows, though,
I didn't say wedge, sir. I said lodged.
Yes. Yeah. What's
That's
the
continuous
difference?
and continuous.
What's the difference?
One is that it's present, and one is that it's merely in there, and one is that it's wedged in there.
Right. You're not suggesting wedged.
No, that it was in the line. 7th, Mr. Colin Piper, Paria's incident commander, was at the time well aware of the incident locally and abroad, where rescuers had perished in the course of effecting a rescue. See paragraph 102 of Mr. Colin Piper's statement dated the 1st of September 2022. I think Mr. Piper drew some criticism from, I cannot remember if it was Mr. Ramadan, most likely it was, for that knowledge. But the fact is that if that is the man's knowledge, you have to, all decisions of every human being, every individual, every entity is made on the basis and factoring in the knowledge at the material time of making a decision. So Mr. Piper included in his statement that he was aware of that on that evening.
And one of the things that I've struggled with, as you'll appreciate, during the course of this evidence is that nobody seems to have been working to any timeline, including Mr. Piper, who was ultimately in charge of the IMT. I mean, I have to say, I do find that an extraordinary feature that any IMT would be operating with a view to trying to effect a rescue without having very clearly in mind and every decision being made against the background of a timeline. And nobody seemed to me to have addressed that issue at all. seems as if the first time it was ever mentioned was when I raised it, or Mr. Maharaj raised it during the course of questions of any of the witnesses. And then they were being asked to put timelines on it. We've had various different hours being placed on it. But it seems to me that even given the heat of the moment, that was almost certainly the first thing that should have gone up on that whiteboard. Hour 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. And that all decisions should have been made against a background of what was expected to be the life expectancy of the people in the pipe. Do you agree with that?
That's a reasonable observation, sir. That's a reasonable observation.
Thank you.
Eighth, none of the entities or persons contacted by Paria were prepared to undertake entry into that pipeline. The Coast Guard advised that the personnel were neither trained nor did they possess the specialist equipment to undertake a rescue from within the pipeline. Mr. Johnson from Eastern Emergency Response Limited advised that their confined space technicians did not have the expertise to do an underwater rescue. Mr. Fitzroy King, dive supervisor from Mitchell Professional Diving Services Company Limited, advised that the risk of diving into the pipe was too high and he could not send his divers into the pipeline.
I'm happy to accept that none of the people that your clients spoke to about this were that they had engaged were prepared to enter into the pipeline.
Thank you, sir. So I can move on, sir.
You can.
Ninth, several of the diving experts who have given evidence have advised that in circumstances it would have been unsafe to enter into the pipeline to undertake a rescue of the divers. That came from Mr. Krishna Fuentes. I think he put it graphically, you don't dive into pipe. Mr. Rolf Seals and Mr. Anthony Donawa.
Well, I think they all postulated the prospect that it was possible, providing the right equipment and features were in place. They didn't rule it out.
No,
None of them ruled it out.
I'm coming to that, sir.
Right.
10th, the evidence of Mr. Seals and Mr. Fuentes is that a rescue operation to be safely undertaken into the pipe would require, I counted it, I hope I got it right, about 7 commercial divers, each with their own umbilical attachment, and he gave a description as to different points along the way where each person had to be put.
Well, I'm not sure that's entirely correct. I think partially it is. I don't think each were required to have their own umbilicals because some of them would have been on shore.
No, one was in the habitat.
7 divers, as I understand it. You need, first of all, a supervisor. Now, he would have been on shore. And there would have been tenders for the umbilicals.
Upstairs, that's 2.
Well, whether that's right or not, there'd have been, at each point in which it might get snagged, there would have to be a tender. So the person at the entrance to the chamber would have had to have been there tending that. As it goes into the pipe, there'd be another one on the inside of the chamber in dry conditions, tendering the umbilical there. Then there was another one at the elbow inside the pipe itself.
That's 5.
And then there's one along the pipe who's affecting the rescue.
That's 6.
That's 6. I took it to be 6 or so.
I said 7.
It may be there were others, but they wouldn't all need to have their own umbilicals. Clearly, the ones in the pipeline would have to have their own umbilicals.
And I think the one in the 7th I got was there was a standby diver.
And a standby. You're quite right.
That's
there was a standby as well. Yeah. Yes. So perhaps that's right. But not all requiring their own.
Not all requiring, no. The standby needs to have, I think, the man in the chamber, but those on top don't need to have.
All right. Thank you. Anyway, that they were identifying the sort of number of people that were necessary. Yes. In their view.
That brings me to the 11th.
The 11th,
point.
yes.
Mr. Kerban went in and went, we heard 10, 12 feet past the elbow and came back out.
Yes.
Then we heard that Mr. Beddoe and his brother were prepared to go. But even though, if we factor in Mr. Kurban, Mr. Bedo, and his brother, that's 3. So if we were to accept the evidence of the experts that we need at least, let's say 6, we're still short of, we only have half of the team of Mr. Kurban, Mr. Bedo, and Mr. Guerra, I think, and Mr. Farah as the supervisor. So we're still short of persons, according to the expert evidence, to effect a safe rescue into the pipe. And also another factor, a variable we have not factored in.
So your point is not enough men were available, even if they have been.
Exactly,
Yeah.
yes, sir. And another factor, I think Mr. Fuentes alluded to it, is, but there are 2 other factors, I didn't put them here, but I don't remember them. There are 2 other factors that when a diver goes in, he may experience difficulty, so he may have to come back out and be replaced. He said that he may get to a certain point in the line and he may have to come back out. If he comes back out, you cannot use him immediately. So you have to rest him.
Well, it depends how long he's been in.
Yeah, that's it. So it depends.
Yeah, but he might have only been in 15 minutes.
And if he didn't, then you have to, so in planning, and that's why planning is important.
Yeah.
So in planning a dive, you have to factor in that factor. And that is the point I wish to leave with the Commission.
Well, I know, but I mean, the point here is the attempt at rescue. Any attempt at rescue doesn't mean it's going to succeed.
No.
And the criticism, such as it is that there was no attempt to rescue. Now, if somebody had gone into pipe and for whatever reason had to come out and then there wasn't another diver available to swap with him, well, then you've at least attempted, you've done something.
Yes, sir.
It can't work because this is what's happened.
And that is the difficulty in this matter. We're moving to the point of you did not attempt a rescue, but we have to be dealing with the decision to even attempt. That's where we are to.
Yes.
Friday evening, the decision to attempt. And that is where we are at. And we hear from LMCS mainly that, I think Mr. Grandmother called it an order, not to dive into the pipe, but the evidence is that diving continued even after Mr. Piper said that. And
well, yes, diving into the habitat certainly continued. It seems clear to be
and
the
no
case.
one said that they were restricted physically, although we hear about guns and all of that, from diving. And even after Mr. Piper suggested that, apart from Kurban going in and coming back out, Bedo's evidence, Mr. Bedo's evidence is that he went into the habitat in order to go into the pipe along with young Kurban, but then he recognized that, and reasonably so, that Kurban could not have assisted him because of obvious circumstances. So even when one is trying to blame Mr. Piper for saying no diving into the pipe, after that, attempts were made to go into the pipe, and when Mr. Bedo got there, he realized that Mr. Kurban could not assist him, and he came out. But then when you marry that against the expert advice, because you have to take into account, Mr. Fuentes and, well, I don't have any discipline in diving, but Mr. Fuentes and the evidence I don't think could be challenged, and Mr. Bedo would have the same kind of knowledge and expertise as them. So we have to
Well, I know, but I mean, what's clear to me from the various people who have given evidence and talked about the prospect of carrying out a dive in these circumstances, each seems to have had a slightly different approach. One would say, I need this, another one would say, I need that, and so on. And I suppose it must inevitably be up to the individual diving supervisor to make a determination of what he regarded as being important before he would effect such a search. And it seems to me that there are different views about that, and each individual supervisor might have had a different view. But it does bring me to the point, sorry, just while I have it in my mind, it does bring me to the point which has been explored with a number of people. Is there a difference between permitting and inviting or asking, permitting someone to dive into the pipe and or asking people to dive in the pipe? Do you see a distinction between those two?
There is a distinction, and I hear Mr. Ramada talk about peeping home and I go running, wailing for me and thing. I would be appreciated if he saved me and thing, but I could understand if he didn't. But, I could be wrong, but the point is, there's a difference. Paria is a plant, a gas and oil installation. it is not a situation where one is on a beach and see someone in difficulty and they could decide, I would try to save him and I could swim well, or I'm not good enough, I'm not taking that risk.
Yes.
If Mr. Piper had made that decision and sending someone in that pipe and they succumbed, I could see a commission of inquiry and I could hear Mr. Ramadan and others. Did you know the condition inside that pipe when you authorized the men to go in there? So you send men in, you know men missing, men could have been dead, and you send in other people, and then I hear about exoneration and indemnity. Mr. Piper and Paria have been criticized for asking for a plan, but against that, I hearing that he should have get somebody to sign an indemnity to exonerate Paria to go into the pipe. No one could exonerate and give persons indemnity against criminal prosecution.
I agree. I doubt how effective that would be.
Well, I'm always a student, but I was willing to learn if it's something I missed in law school, because some classes I didn't go to. So I was wondering if there was something I missed. So when they throwing that at Mr. Paria and Mr. Piper that you couldn't do that. And one may say, whether a person's voluntarily going or you're permitting or you're allowing, there's nice words, but the point is, anyone who had gone into that pipe that evening would have been going in there under the auspices of Paria and the management of Paria.
Well, is that entirely correct? I mean, I appreciate it's their plant, right? They're responsible for their own land, their own plant. But is there a distinction to be drawn between somebody who says, not to put too fine a point, let's be quite crude about it for the moment, just to illustrate the point I'm making. If the criteria for effecting a rescue is a better than 50% chance, let's say, and somebody says, well, there isn't a better than 50% chance, and therefore I'm not going into the pipe to effect the rescue. Right? That's on the one hand. One could understand that. So Mr. Piper saying, one of the teams that he's employed, is there a better than 50% chance of effecting a rescue? They say no, and so he says, well, I'm not going to ask you to go into the pipe, all right, on that basis. Somebody else says, I accept that there's not a better than 50% chance. It's only a 30% chance of it being successful. But I am willing to take that chance. Should Mr. Piper in those circumstances prevent him from taking that chance?
The difficulty Mr. Piper would have had at that point, sir, is that he had experts, and I only factored in not knowing the conditions within the pipe if he were to attract criminal liability to himself. But he just made a point again against him making that decision, because I could have heard lawyers asking him in a commission, Mitchell tell you them men sending in their people. This one tell you they're not sending in their people. OSTL, and you know they are commercial divers, and you know that equipment, and they say they're not sending in people, but you
don't have to pretend to be Mr. Ramadan, you know.
Well, that's the only way I could make the point effectively, sir.
I get the point, yes.
Yes.
But, you know, Mr. Piper might have said, for example, look, I am not going to stop you, physically stop you. I'm telling you, don't go in the pipe. I'm saying it is unsafe in the pipe. All of the advice we've had suggests that it is completely wrong for anyone to entertain such a risk. And that is the position that we adopt. Do not go in that pipe. But I'm not, and I make clear, I'm not going to physically prevent you from doing it. If that's what you want to do, that's on your head.
So that is exactly the point too. There's no evidence of anybody physically prevented anybody from going into that pipe.
Right. But do you agree with me that he could have taken that stuff? If that had a risk, could have taken that. There's a difference between asking people to effect a rescue and effectively allowing those who, in defiance of your best advice, seek nonetheless to try and rescue.
One could have done that, but that will be totally a personal decision, because if you had done that and the person perished, I could see Mr. Piper for the rest of his days saying, But why I didn't stand for him and tell this man he can't go in the pipe?
Yeah, well, I'm assuming,
So it's not
I'm
that,
assuming he would have done that, would have said no. Given his evidence and the
Yes.
approach he's taken during the course of the IMT, his position was, I never had sufficient information to be able to justify anyone going in that pipe.
And yes, and the point I wish to make, there is no evidence of anybody physically restraining anybody from going into that pipe. But what we hear here is that...
Well, there's a little bit, but...
what we have here says that I was there, I saw Coast Guard men. In fact, at one point, somebody started to allude to, but I see they back off from the evidence, that there was a huge Coast Guard vessel off the way out off the jetty, and they were prevented, had guns. I mean, there's no evidence to bring that to the shore.
You don't have to persuade me of that. Yeah.
But there's no evidence that anybody was physically restrained from disregarding Mr. Piper and going into the pipe. But now, when we're in these nice surroundings, people are saying, well, I would have gone if, maybe. But then the point too, that Mr. Piper made a point in his evidence that I didn't think of. I think in answer to the commission, or maybe Mr. Maraj. He said, it would have been easier for me to just make the easiest decision to make was to tell people go.
Yes,
the hard decision was really to tell people in the face of the unknowns not to go.
Certainly that's what he said, yes. How are we doing?
2 more minutes, sir.
Well, we got to point 11, so I'm assuming there aren't any more points on that issue.
I see I have 12, sir. No, I said 11, but all this couldn't come.
You got a number 12?
None of the divers or diving professionals had a workable or credible risk. Well, I think I made that point already. The last point for completeness, sir, it is necessary to address one final allegation which has been leveled against Paria in connection with this issue that afternoon and rescue efforts. Namely, that Paria stopped LMCS and others from carrying out any rescue attempt that night. That's the allegation. Or during the 26th of February 2022. We respectfully submit, sir, that this allegation cannot be supported out of a proper analysis of the facts. While it is not disputed that Paria told persons not to dive into the pipe because it was too dangerous, the reality is that persons were not prevented from doing so because the evidence shows that persons continue to dive thereafter into the night.
No, well, I mean, you've made that point, but I mean, I think there's a distinction between those who were diving into, for example, the habitat for the purposes of, no doubt, ensuring that if anybody was trying to come out, that they would have been able to be pulled out, because we knew that Mr. Boudram was unable to get out of the pipe himself, having got to the surface level of the fluid in the pipe. So it doesn't surprise me that people were, whilst there was a habitat in place, diving into that habitat to ensure that if anybody else managed to crawl their way through this pipe, that they would have been able to be taken from there. But I think apart from Mr. Kerban, nobody else went into the pipe. Certainly there's no evidence of that.
Yes, and that's the point. Persons
the point
who
you're making
allowed,
is they could have done if they wanted to.
People were not prevented from going into the habitat. To get into the habitat, they could get into the pipe. So the fact that they weren't prevented from going into the habitat, once they get into the habitat is underwater. Yeah.
Well, there would have had to have been quite a lot of more activity. I mean, there were, to fit all the appropriate equipment would have taken some effort. I don't know what would have happened. Anyway, I've got your point.
But I want to suggest in closing that I wish Mr. Ramadan was here, because I wanted to describe his invitation to the Commission for criminal proceedings against Paria or its personnel as outrageous on the evidence. It will grab a good headline, it will grab newspaper front line and front page, but on the evidence, it cannot be supported. There is no evidence here of anything close to criminal conduct. There would have been something close to criminal conduct.
We'd have to find that there was gross negligence, wouldn't we?
To have that.
Yes.
Yes, sir. And that is why I was a bit taken aback at the invitation. But I know that the Commission would not fall prey easily to such temptation. But I have 2 recommendations I've been able to put together so far. So, and one is this, that you may want to recommend guidelines for scuba. And it seems from the experts that scuba is not to be used in commercial work like this. So that is one recommendation that I would respectfully put forward for your consideration.
Well, guidelines in relation to
the use of diving and the
commercial diving.
Yes, and the type of diving for commercial.
Yes.
Secondly, sir, that we heard the evidence here that there has not been any. We heard of a person who's been qualified in saturation dive. Commissioner Wilson, I might be encroaching on his area here, but we heard people talking about saturation dive and confined space diving. There may be some recommendation around that with respect to fine-tuning that confined space to include things like maybe pipeline, 50 inches, 30 inches, as the case may be, since Trinidad and Tobago is an oil and gas industry and have several industrial plants. So apart from just general confined space, I don't know if there could, I don't know the discipline, whether it could be further tweaked and be more specific to deal with the more likely risk that would arise in the oil and gas industry.
What, that there should be some training for people to dive into a pipeline?
I don't know if that's physically. It may be, it may be.
Why don't we get rid of 30-inch pipelines, have them either smaller or bigger? If they're smaller, you can't get sucked in, and if they're bigger, you could turn around.
Senator, for me, yes. Well, I heard Mr. Farah say he could turn around. And, anyway. I have this recommendation, sir, that there be a national registry for resources to respond to emergencies. Because you realize in the evidence, sir, that there was a lot of calling around. Do you have a ROV? Do you have this? Do you have that asset? If we have, and they can model it from, there's some legislation in Trinidad for procurement, for example, where they have a registry of skills and that kind of thing. If there's a national registry, so if I, example, get a certificate in some specialized area of diving, not from a witness that was here, but if I get a certificate from, in some area, I may go and register and voluntarily put myself on the register in the event that there's an emergency that I could be contacted. So if you have develop a national registry for assets and personnel and the specialized area of training, so that when there's an event, you call the National Emergency Registry, and you know that there is A, B, C. They can be contacted at these numbers, these assets. So you don't have to be calling around and say, I wonder if so-and-so has this equipment, I wonder if so-and-so has this equipment. You could go there at the first call to see what is available to respond to an emergency or crisis.
Well, I mean, I see some value in that. There is an argument, isn't there, for any plant of the kind that we're dealing with here to have certain equipment available to them all the time. I mean, leave aside the question of people being sucked into a pipe. There may be any number of other reasons why you would want to put a camera inside a pipe, for example. Yeah. Tools, things get caught up in there. There are gurglings, whatever it might be, within a pipe that might justify putting a camera in there. Mm-hmm. And one might have thought that a company as big as Paria might have had some sort of mechanism on site for achieving the same. Certainly that's something I'll consider with Mr. Wilson as to whether or not such a recommendation should be made.
Yes.
But I think as to national registry, whilst I'm attracted to it to this extent.
Yes, sorry.
It seems to us that there are emergencies which take place which could not be predicted. This one, as a matter of fact, might have been predicted, but it wasn't. All right? So it falls into the category of emergency that might take place that is not predicted. So this country doesn't experience hurricanes, so not much is being done to deal with hurricanes. Similarly, supposing on that day a ship had come along and had rammed straight into the berth, out of control. Now that couldn't be predicted, but they would have to kick in, wouldn't they? Some sort of emergency procedure to try and help the people that might be in the ship that's gone down, the hut that's now underwater, any number of possible scenarios that could emerge in an emergency situation where you haven't predicted what might happen. And certainly it seems to me at the moment, and I think Mr. Wilson's not unpersuaded, that there may be some sort of general emergency plan that people ought to have that can kick in that situation, and the sort of register you're talking about might assist in that. It would necessarily bring together certain skills that might be outside of the interested parties, which might have its own attraction. So certainly, yes, I think that
because I was going to say, sir, this recommendation is wider than Paria.
Yes.
Use Paria as the example, but there may be smaller companies that will have similar emergencies but don't have the resources or have the equipment. So they can go to this registry and right away they know where they could locate instead of asking around and getting, fishing to see who may have, like Mr. Fuentes talk about a hazmat suit. For example, if someone has a hazmat suit, instead of having it thrown in the warehouse somewhere, they'll go and register, I have a hazmat suit. So if you're looking for a hazmat suit, you don't have to be calling around.
In what, 3 different sizes? Or, I mean,
well, so I told Paria with the PPE they had to get bigger sizes after this commission. But that's what I was thinking about.
Pointing at me when you say that. All right. I mean, yes. Are there any other recommendations?
No, sir. I want to rest it there for the
do you think that that Paria might have carried out some sort of testing of their system since this event? That is to say, that they have. This has happened. It happened back in nearly a year ago now, and the same people are in place. Whatever the level of confidence in those people might be, do you not think that they ought to have carried out a drill, a system of, what's called a tabletop exercise of the issues involved here to see what might have gone wrong, what forms might be changed, what things might have been done to correct, albeit they don't accept any responsibility, but correct the potential flaws or ambiguities that we've identified in the course of this inquiry. I mean, a number of your witnesses and others have accepted ambiguities at best and misleading statements at worst, contained in documents and so on. And I'm slightly disappointed that a company the size of Paria, unlike Heritage, which seems to do regular testing, that they've done nothing, apparently, since this has happened, beyond what looks to be a relatively cursory examination with 2 very small recommendations. That no drill or tabletop exercise has been done.
I'm sure that will be undertaken soon, if not after your recommendations, but your suggestion, I'm sure, is not been lost.
Well, we're going to write our report. I've made it pretty clear that we will have it ready by April. I'm not in control of whether it is published or not. That is in the hands of others. But to say you're going to wait to the outcome of this inquiry before carrying out anything, as I think Mr. Mohammed said, is perhaps a little disappointing.
The sentiments would be factored in soon.
All right, thank you.
It is left for me to thank you, Mr. Chairman and fellow Commissioner Wilson, and thanks to the Commission and my colleagues for tolerating me.
No, I thank you very much for your submissions.
And I have one complaint, sir, and a compliment. I have a compliment for Ms. Sinanan behind you, for her competencies, efficiencies.
Yes.
But I don't understand how people could be sending email 2 o'clock in the morning and 3 o'clock. I thought you used to sleep, sir.
Yes, well, I mean, believe me, I've had messages all kinds of hours of the night from her.
Thank you, sir.
All right, lovely. Thank you very much indeed. Right, so that is it for today. Would it be inconvenient to sit at 9:30 tomorrow? Anybody have a problem with that? I think the sooner we finish, the sooner we can stop and have some refreshments and close this inquiry, or the evidential stages of this inquiry. Thank you very much indeed.
Mr. Wilson asks, Mr. Mutu asks to be excused in the morning. He's in Court of Appeal, but I'll be here at 9:30, sir. And he will join us later.
Of course, no problem at all. All right, well, I will see you all tomorrow, 9:30. We have a target time of midday-ish, I think, is where we're aiming for, one way or the other, to close these proceedings. All right, thank you very much indeed. Please gather your papers. I'll be doing the same.